I want to welcome you to the 2015 Minnesotans Military Appreciation Fund Dinner. My name is Tom Hauser. I'm the chief political reporter for 5 Eyewitness News. I have no idea why I just felt the need to read that since I've been doing that for 22 years. But it was in front of me, so I thought I would stick with the script. I am going to be your MC this evening. I also, as many of you may recall, had the privilege of emceeing this event last year. I've also emceed MMAF's Say Thanks Day event, and it's great to be back again to honor so many military veterans and their families. You may recall last year I talked about how interesting it is whenever I do an event in this hotel, because this is also where I spent my senior prom. Just down the hall, down the escalator, you don't want to know any more than that. I was also here for my 5-year high school reunion. Statute of limitations, still not up on that one, so I can't tell you anything about that either. Now, I thought there was pressure last year, but just moments ago as I was walking back into the room, back in that corner is a table full of my old fraternity brothers from the University of St. Thomas. Can you guys stand and be recognized? Proud supporters of MMAF and promising to hold my feet to the fire tonight. To every one of us, we have a reason why we're here tonight. Many of you have served in the military or currently serve in the military. Many, and I would even hazard a guess to say all of you, have a family member of one kind or another who either has served in the military or does serve in the military. I shared this story last year. I think it bears repeating for people who were not here last year, but in my family, my dad served in the Air Force near the end of World War II. His brother fought in the Philippines during World War II. On my mom's side of the family, she had 3 brothers, 2 who served in the Air Force and 1 who served in the Navy. The uncle who served in the Navy sacrificed his life for his country when his plane went down in the South China Sea early in the Vietnam War when he was on a reconnaissance mission. I was too young to remember exactly what happened that day, but my older brothers and sisters still vividly remember my mother collapsing on the floor of our house at 5909 Grimes Avenue, just a couple miles from here, when she saw the Navy chaplain walking up the front steps. Perhaps some of you have been through something similar, or you have family members who have been through that, but it is something that a family never fully heals from, but you can try to make progress, and you can continue to honor these military veterans. Another uncle of mine flew many combat missions over Cambodia and Vietnam, and later died of Agent Orange poisoning from some of the chemicals that were dropped in the jungles of Vietnam. So in my family, there has been a lot of sacrifice. I'm sure in many of your families, there has also been a lot of sacrifice. And like the members of my family who've had the call to serve, countless others, again, many of you here tonight, have rushed towards danger instead of away from it in times of crisis. We're here tonight to honor these brave service people and their families. They all deserve profound recognition, the utmost respect, and a sincere thank you. Many of them are still serving. Yes, that's... As I mentioned before, many of them are still serving and may be deployed again in the near term. It takes a community effort to fully support veterans and their families, and by joining together, it is amazing what we can accomplish. That's what we're part of tonight. Since MMAF was founded in 2005, thanks to the generosity of thousands of people just like all of you, this organization has raised more than $16 million. Together we can say thanks and keep this statewide effort strong and vital. We can let our veterans know that we are deeply grateful for their sacrifices. You're going to hear from many people tonight, among them a dual military couple of 17 years, the father of a current U.S. Special Forces officer, and a former CIA officer and national security expert who was intimately involved in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Now, we look forward to hearing their insights and experiences, and I'm sure they will inspire all of us tonight and remind us why we are all so thankful. Now, to begin our evening, please stand as members of the Minnesota National Guard 34th Infantry Color Guard present our colors.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Now, another big honor I have is to introduce a man who, without question, is one of the greatest soldiers of his generation, or any generation, and certainly one of the greatest soldiers ever to represent the United States Army. Born right here in Minneapolis and a proud member of the Minnesota National Guard at the ripe old age of 16, General John W. Vessey is the longest-serving active service member in U.S. history and the only soldier to attain every rank the Army had to offer. In 1944, then First Sergeant Vessey earned a battlefield promotion to second lieutenant for his tenacity and valor during the Battle of Anzio, which succeeded in toppling fascist Italy and paved the way for Allied victory in World War II. Later, during the Vietnam War, then Lieutenant Colonel Vessey earned the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership and defense of a fire support base during Operation Junction City. In 1982, General Vessey became the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President Reagan, and later championed the search for prisoners of war and service members listed as missing in action as a special emissary to Vietnam during the Clinton administration. General Vessey and Gene Sitt were good friends for many years, united in their love for the United States and equally passionate about recognizing the sacrifices our men and women in uniform make every day for our country. When Gene first had the idea to form MMAF, the first person he called was General Vessey. And tonight we are honored to have General Vessey here to say a few words. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you General John William Vessey, Jr., United States Army.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. This night is all about saying thanks to the troops, and those troops particularly that have served since the attack on 9/11 and have gone through the bitter and difficult campaigns that the country has waged since then. But I'm going to change the routine here a little bit. This is judgment that you're authorized. I'm not the oldest vet in Minnesota today, but I'm pretty close to competing for that title. But I know I'm the highest ranking vet around here in terms of military service. So So I'm going to change the agenda a little bit about the thanks. And I think we deserve to say thanks particularly to Gene Sitt and to his wife Gail for starting this wonderful program here. I'm going to tell you a Gene Sitt story, and I've probably told it before, and if I've heard it, you just act like you never heard it before. Anyway, you know that JCS chairman shouldn't tell jokes about living ethnic groups because it's not politically correct to do that. So I tell Hittite stories, and for you historians, the Hittites reached the height of their civilization about 1400 BC and passed from the earth about 700 BC. And this particular story is about two Hittites named Sven and Ole. And Sven and Ole went to the lumber yard, and Ole had to do something with the truck and sent Sven in. And Sven said to the clerk, asked him what he wanted, and Sven said to the clerk, "Do you want some 4x2s?" And the clerk said, "I think it's 2x4s that you want." And Sven says, "Just a minute." He says, "I checked with Ole." He went out and talked to Ole and came back, and he said, "Yeah, you're right, it's 2x4s we want." And the clerk said, "Well, how long would you like them?" And he said, "Just a minute, I checked with Ole again." And he came back in and he said, "Ole said we gotta have those boards a long time because we're gonna build a house with them." Well, Gene Sitt was one of those wonderful people that we have in this world from time to time who took things on with the long view of how it would affect the community and the country and the people around him. But it also had to have some movement in the short view. And he was a builder, whether it was building his wonderful family or building a business that has survived and served the community well, or helping with the orchestra or the Minneapolis Institute of Arts or the Historical Society or local colleges and universities. Gene was a builder. And he was smart enough to hire smart people around him to help him do the job. And we owe all of them some thanks, but particularly Gene and Gail for starting this operation. But we all need to say thanks to people like Michael Gorman and Denny Scholstedt and who's that other guy, that son-in-law of mine? Skip Krozik, who made this operation go. And one important part of it is the fellow who heads it now, and one of Gene's wonderful sons, second son, Roger, who does other important things like run Sid Investment Associates, but really he runs MMAF, former Air Force officer, graduate of the Air Force Academy, and a good guy and a smart guy. Roger, sit.
Always got to worry when someone goes off script, but when General Vessey goes off script, you just say, yes, sir. Thank you, everyone, and I'm so glad to see all of you here this evening. Tonight, we honor the military members for their commitment and sacrifices. We honor their families for their unending support and encouragement. And we thank all of them for their importance to our nation and the sacrifices that they have made. We also want to extend our gratitude to all our generous individual and corporate donors, as well as those who hold fundraising events on behalf of MMAF. Thanks to your generous contributions, MMAF has awarded nearly 16,000 grants to Minnesota service members, totaling more than $9.5 million since the inception in 2005. The numbers break down as follows. $500 grants have been awarded to over 15,000 service members, Minnesota service members, who have served honorably in a combat zone since 9/11. $2,000 grants have been awarded to 455 Purple Heart recipients, and 127 of those Purple Heart recipients received a second grant of up to $8,000 based on the severity of their injuries. $5,000 grants have been awarded to 64 families for those service members who were unfortunately killed in action. There are no conditions on how the grant is to be spent. The grant is simply a token of appreciation and thanks from Minnesotans to Minnesotans. Their grants are small relative to all the commitment and sacrifice our service members and their families are making, but we want them to know that we are thinking of them and appreciate what they're doing for our country. I want to note that we continue a solid track record of giving 90% of every dollar raised directly to our troops. In August of this year, MMAF will be a decade old. Our organization was founded in response to the tragedy of 9/11 during a time of high emotion and urgency of war on terrorism. By October 2005, 2,000 Americans had made the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq. Coverage of the war was on the front page. The evening news covered new deployments and redeployments. Today, the media coverage is ongoing. The media coverage of the ongoing military operations have lessened, and many do not realize that service members continue to serve abroad in great numbers and in harm's way. In fact, the U.S. has active military troops stationed in nearly 150 countries. This does not include the Navy and Marine Corps personnel at sea, and just for perspective, there are less than 200 countries in the world. So thank you all for your service. Since 9/11, over 80,000 Minnesotans have served on active duty. In the Minnesota National Guard alone, we know that more than 26,000 have been deployed since 9/11. Minnesota is the 5th largest contributor among the states in deployments of its National Guard, disproportionately contributing to an ongoing military operations abroad. Many of our Guard members have deployed multiple times, and another deployment is scheduled for early 2016. Therefore, our mission continues unabated. We remain dedicated to thanking and awarding grants to all Minnesotans who have served since 9/11, and we intend to do so as long as Minnesotans continue to serve in harm's way. We owe a great debt to those who carry the burden for the rest of us in this country. Thank you. Now, I'll be going off script a little bit, and I was only a captain when I got out of the service. But before Chaplain Morris gives his invocation, I would like to pay a special tribute to someone we knew who knew the meaning of commitment, sacrifice, and love of country. Avis Claire Vessey passed away less than 3 weeks ago at the age of 92. She was the wife of General Vessey for nearly 70 years. Like all successful military couples, General Vessey and Mrs. Vessey were a team. The general would be the first to say that he could not have had the distinguished military career he had without Mrs. Vessey. Mrs. Vessey met the general at Roosevelt High School here in Minneapolis in chemistry class. The general said the two of them had, quote unquote, the best chemistry. Mrs. Vessey went on to study at the University of Minnesota, majoring in art, and then teaching art thereafter. After World War II, on July 18, 1945, General and Mrs. Vessey married, and it was at that time that Mrs. Vessey said her career changed. She became a soldier's wife. A soldier's wife is tested time and time again in their ability to adapt, to endure, to be strong, and to keep a sense of humor and positive attitude. It was Mrs. Vessey who made every house a home and every yard a garden, and she did this over 30 times on military installations all over the world. The Vessey's first home was at Fort Sill, an Army post in Oklahoma. Home was a rickety, couple-room decommissioned hospital building where there was no basement. The Vesseys survived a tornado that destroyed half of their home. Military wives live wherever and in whatever is provided. The Vesseys had 3 children, John, Sarah, and David. The Vessey children went to 12 different schools on 3 continents. Mrs. Vessey made every transition as smooth as possible. Their children grew up to believe that military life was not a sacrifice, but an adventure. This flexibility and positive attitude served Mrs. Vessey well when she found herself hosting senior foreign military and political leaders, kings, and even dictators in her home, often without advance notice. Mrs. Vessey kept the sense of duty and sense of humor throughout her husband's 46 years of military service. On one occasion, when the Vesseys lived in the Far East, after dutifully accompanying her husband to a formal dinner, Mrs. Vessey asked the general, "How many slippery sea slugs will I have to eat with silver chopsticks for the service of my country?" Military families can identify with Avis Claire Vessey. I'd like you to please raise your glass. Here's to Mrs. Vessey. It takes a strong person to be a soldier. It takes a stronger person to love and support a soldier for nearly 70 years. You will be dearly missed and always remembered. Hear, hear.
Everyone else is going off script, so I will too. Let's have a quick moment of silence for Avis Claire Vessey before our invocation. And now please join me in welcoming Chaplain Colonel John Morris for tonight's invocation.
General Vessey, General Nash, Mr. Sitt, Mrs. Sitt, and family, fellow patriots and lovers of liberty, would you bow with me as I offer this invocation in the Christian tradition? Heavenly Father, thank you for the freedom that enables us to gather this evening. I'm mindful that in our midst are grieving families who've lost loved ones in combat. I know that there are men and women here who are struggling with the wounds of war. Also, Heavenly Father, our combat veterans, men and women who've carried rifles far forward on our behalf. And with them, those who love them and those who love our nation. And I come before you to seek a blessing for all. But tonight, Father, particularly for those who are far forward, our fellow Minnesotans who are under the sea, in the air, on ships, and in remote locations in eastern Afghanistan, Kuwait, Djibouti, Jordan, and places undisclosed. For them and their families, tonight we ask an extra measure of strength. For those who've given us this meal, we ask your blessing, and for us who are about to receive it, we pray for health. Health, not that we may serve self, but that we might find greater ways to strengthen our nation, keep her free, and celebrate the love of liberty with those who are not yet free. I ask this in your Son's most precious name. Amen.
I would next like to introduce Jim Redpath, the father of a Special Forces officer currently serving in the U.S. Army. Please join me in welcoming Jim Redpath.
Thank you, great meal. Skip, you told me there's going to be 25 people here, not 2,500. This is not my speech. These are some tax planning hints in case I need to change up the program too. I'm a CPA. Wow. I'm the only speaker tonight who hasn't served, and that's my loss. But my father over here served. My father-in-law fought in the Battle of the Bulge. My son's currently in the Army. We'll talk about him in a second. I was asked to give a father's perspective of what it's like to have a son deployed in harm's way and fighting a war. I guess that means instead of a mother's perspective or something. So you asked for it, you're going to get it. Let me set the stage. We're talking about our youngest child. And if I say I mean our, because Jan will get mad at me later on because it's our children. Our youngest child, Jim. Most people call him Jimmy. He couldn't be here tonight. He's training for his next mission, but he's well represented. His grandparents are here, Dick and Eileen Redpath. His uncle, my brother John, is here. His godmother and my brother John's wife, Vicki, is here. And of course, his mom and my wife, Jan, is here too tonight. So he's well represented. Let me be frank. Jimmy was a complete pain in the ass. He was our trouble child. He put his mother and me through some tough situations. Sleepless nights. His sister and brothers, they were different. They were successful in their pursuits. All three went to college and pursued the career of their choices. According to Jimmy, it was boring like Dad. But Jimmy isn't a bad person. He just did things his own way and didn't think about the repercussions. The reason he's in the Army is because when we sent him to college, he forgot that part where you're supposed to go to class. He was actually the goalie on the hockey team. Goalie tells you something about him too, right? He was a goalie on the hockey team, and I called the school up to get the second semester bill, and they basically told me I didn't owe anything because he wasn't registered for any classes. So I called him up, blew my stack, right? Told him to have the stuff ready. I'd be there in 3 hours, and we're coming home. We had a long trip home. Got home, and I said, hey, you got to figure your life out, buddy. 2, 3 weeks later, he came in the house. He looked at me and he said, "Dad, I'm going to do a stint in the Army. I just joined." My first thought was, awesome. This could be good for him. My first question was, you know we're at war, right? And Jimmy's fashion looks at me and he goes, "Dad, if you're going to go in, you got to go all in." Well, it ended up being a lot more than a stint. He became amazing to us. He became an infantryman, was deployed, became an airborne Army Ranger, was deployed again, and became a Special Forces Green Beret and was deployed one more time. Thank you. He found his way and figured out his life. We've experienced some wonderful events with our kids throughout our life. We've seen our daughter graduate, summa cum laude, top of her math class at University of Wisconsin. We've seen our son get sworn in as a lawyer and admitted to the bar by the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. We've watched our kids participate in all kinds of athletic events. All 3 of our boys played in the Minnesota State High School hockey tournament. That's a big deal here in Minnesota. But I hadn't seen anything till I saw a basic training graduation, an airborne graduation, an Army Ranger graduation, or the donning of the Special Forces Green Beret ceremony. Those are incredible events, if you've been to them. The pomp and circumstance gives you goosebumps. Everybody in attendance is so happy and so proud, family and friends, and especially the young military men and women who are making the commitment to serve, in my mind, the greatest country ever, ever. Jimmy is currently in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He's a staff sergeant and the weapons sergeant on his 12-person Green Beret Special Forces team. Like I said, he's been deployed 3 times, twice in Iraq and most recently in Afghanistan. He returned last December. And he truly, truly looks forward to getting deployed again this summer, somewhere in the Middle East, to continue the mission. We are really fortunate that he's come home each and every time, safe, healthy, and mentally sound. A lot of troops haven't. Thank God for organizations like MMAF and others that are here to help them. People ask me when he's deployed, friends and family, what is it like? What does it feel like to have a son fighting in a war? And I tell them it's still sleepless nights, just for a different reason. I tell them it's scary and fulfilling at the same time. You're so proud to have someone you love so much serving this great nation and willing to put himself in harm's way, to put his life on the line, to save others and to protect our freedom, but you're so scared about what could happen. For me, the worst part when he's deployed is what I call the guilt. And it goes like this. Jan and I are laying on the couch, worried about Jimmy, thinking about what's going on. Is he fighting? Is he safe? We're watching TV, and we see that 2, 3, 5 soldiers are killed in Ramadi, Iraq. Imagine the feeling. And now the waiting begins. You sit and you wait for 2 things. 1, you hope to God you hear either an email or a call from Jimmy, or 2, an Army car pulls up to your house and gives you some bad news. Days later, sometimes weeks later, we get the call. We're so relieved, we're so happy, we're ecstatic. It's incredible. The feeling, he's okay, he's safe. And then the guilt hits. Here we are celebrating, relieved and happy, ecstatic, because our son is safe and sound, when someone else's son is coming home in a wooden box. That's a terrible feeling. We're not the only ones that felt that. I've talked to other parents, but it is a terrible feeling. Okay, enough of that. I'll close with a short story. The story may sound like I'm bragging, but I'm not. It's one of thousands of stories that proud parents of military personnel could tell. Like I said, Jimmy was a pain in the butt. We had issues. One night, we're in Fort Benning, Georgia, in a bar, celebrating his Ranger graduation, and Sergeant Thompson approaches me. Sergeant Thompson was Jimmy's sergeant and leader in his first tour in Iraq. And he says, "Mr. Redpath, do you have a moment or two?" And Sergeant Thompson is not like Sergeant Carter of Gomer Pyle. Okay? This is a 27-year-old kid that's an incredible leader. And he pulls me off to the side and we sit down and he says to me, "Mr. Redpath, I know you have issues with your son, but let me talk to you about him." Because when we were in Iraq, every single time we loaded our Bradley fighting machines, whether we were under fire or not, your son stood post and made sure that every guy got in there before he'd go in there. I had to order him into the Bradley. That's the soldier he is, Mr. Redpath. One night, we were wrapping up an intense firefight. We headed back to our Bradleys. We were going to go back to our base, and we got word that our sniper was in trouble and needed help. I got all my men together, Mr. Redpath. I stared them all in the eye. And I said, "I need 2 of you to volunteer to die with me tonight. Because he is not effing dying alone. We're going to get him. I need 2 of you to volunteer to die tonight." Mr. Redpath, your son was the first one to volunteer. All 4 of us made it back. Well, that's the man the Army has helped my son become. My issues went away that night. Don't get me wrong, he still gets on my nerves, and I think he tries to. But my issues went away that night for sure. And I stand here in front of you tonight, a humble, proud, and loving father of a United States Army soldier. I think that's cool. Thank you very much.
If there's anyone who never has to feel any shame about bragging, it is the parent of any member of the military. Thank you to the Redpath family. I'm also heartened to hear that there is hope for me yet. My wife often describes me the same way he describes his son as a youngster. So my wife someday might find that I amount to something. So there's still hope for me. All right, now, up next, I would like to introduce Jackie and Ron Stenger to the stage to tell their very special story. Please come forward.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, service members who have served or are serving this great nation, good evening. My name is Major Jackie Stenger. This is my husband, retired Master Sergeant Ronald Stenger. Let me first tell you that it is an honor to speak in front of a great organization that stands for something that is near and dear to both of us. We've both received grants from Minnesota's Military Appreciation Fund, and we're very thankful for this organization. Today, there are more than 20,000 soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, and Coast Guardsmen from Minnesota currently serving our nation. We have more than 400,000 veterans in the state of Minnesota. Nationally, veterans represent less than 1% of the total population. A small percentage indeed, and an indicator of the real need to raise the level to raise the level of awareness for veterans issues among the general public.
Being a dual military couple for 17 years, we have both been the soldier deployed and the spouse left behind. If asked, we will both tell you that it is much more difficult being the spouse left at home. Tonight, we'd like to share some of our experiences, and we'll conclude by offering a few thoughts on supporting all service members, returning veterans, and their families.
I joined the military at the age of 20, in between my sophomore and junior year of college. I spent the first decade of my career as an enlisted soldier before getting my commission through the Minnesota Officer Candidate School. Ron and I met during annual training at Camp Ripley and have been inseparable ever since. I've deployed overseas on 2 separate occasions, both times to Afghanistan. My first deployment, I was gone for 14 months, and my second deployment, I was gone for 12 months.
I joined the military on Pearl Harbor Day during my senior year of high school. I remained an enlisted soldier throughout my career. I reached the rank of first sergeant before retiring last March. I deployed to Bosnia in 2003 as part of the 34th Infantry Division's Joint Military Affairs Team and was part of the Training and Movement Eval Team. I spent 9 months away from my family. When I deployed, our oldest daughter, Sierra, was 7 years old. She understood I would be going away for a long time and was very sad. She didn't harbor the anger then that she would later have at age 10 when Jackie deployed for the first time. A month prior to my deployment, Jackie and I found out we were pregnant with our youngest daughter, Kylie, which meant I'd missed the entire pregnancy. Today, Sierra is a college freshman and Kylie is in 5th grade. Could Jackie and I have been deployed at the same time? Yes. We're just thankful that we were lucky enough that one of us was able to be home with our girls when the other was deployed. As a dual military couple, we've had to think of things that other couples, even with one spouse being in the military, don't have to think about. Who would be in charge of our finances and look out after our belongings if we were both deployed? We had a family care plan in place at all times. It named a power of attorney along with a guardian, and we created a will and established a trust to ensure our children were taken care of should neither of us come home.
When I was notified that I would be deploying for the first time, I dealt with a spectrum of emotions. First, fear of the unknown. I was unaware of the dangers that would be surrounding me while I was deployed. I was fearful for how my children would handle my deployment, and I was concerned about how my husband would handle not only getting himself through the deployment, but how he would handle getting our girls through the difficulties that deployment brings to a family as well. I also felt a sense of pride, knowing that I was going off to do something that most people will never get the chance to do. Defend the freedoms that all Americans have, but that many take for granted. At that time, Sierra was 10 and Kylie was 2. Sierra completely understood the situation because she had been through it before, when Ron deployed. But I realized that I had to figure out a way to make her understand why I was going to Afghanistan and why I was kind of excited to do so. At that time, Sierra was an avid soccer player. So I asked her, can you imagine practicing soccer all the time and never being able to play the game? She said that it wouldn't be much fun. I then told her that I had been practicing for 15 years and that I was finally getting to play the game. I told her that I didn't want to leave her or Kylie, but I was excited too. It put the situation into a perspective that she could understand. During the first month of that deployment, I took pictures of everything I did: where I lived, where I showered, where I worked, where I exercised, and where I ate. Then I created a PowerPoint entitled "A Day in the Life of Mom," and I sent it to her. This gave her a way to see what I did every day. While on that first deployment, I also had the privilege of going off base to assist with a few humanitarian aid missions. I was able to give clothes, shoes, blankets, food, and school supplies to local children. I then sent those pictures to Sierra to show her how I was helping kids in other countries have a little bit better life. Upon the return from my first deployment, it wasn't all roses. Sierra was angry. She went from having to answer to one parent to having to answer to two. I also came back trying to fit in to how things were before I was deployed, not realizing that while I was gone, things had changed. Let me tell you, there are no harder words to hear than your daughter telling you that she hates you, that your family was better off without you, and that she wished you wouldn't have come back. I knew she was saying those things out of anger, but it didn't soften the blow one bit. Being full-time military, our family has learned to become resilient over the past 17 years. Each deployment, however, has brought different hardships to our family based on the ages of our girls and their emotional needs. It's made us more supportive, not just of our family, but all military families. It also makes me very proud to be a member of the Minnesotans Military Appreciation Fund Steering Committee and their Say Thanks initiative. It's a great way to give back to an organization that has not only supported our family twice, but every Minnesota service member who has deployed in support of our freedoms.
Being a veteran brings a sense of pride in knowing we are doing something that less than 1% of the people in the country volunteer to do. But it does require sacrifices as well. We can't tell you how many birthdays and holidays we've missed with our family, but I can tell you that we have spent less than half of our anniversaries together due to our military schools, drills, annual trainings, and deployments. I can also tell you that we wouldn't have it any other way, as we thoroughly enjoy what we do. There are things that you can do to support Minnesota service members who have served our nation and in some cases paid the ultimate sacrifice. First off, you can vote. It's one of those freedoms that define us as Americans. You can teach your children and grandchildren to respect our nation's colors. Simply stand, take off their hats, place their hands over their hearts when the flag passes by in a parade or when the national anthem is played. If you're an employer, hire today's military members. Why? Service members know how to be part of a team. They perform under pressure, and they are conscious of health and safety standards. Service members are instilled with values you can't find in everyone. Values like duty, honor, integrity, and respect. Veterans are driven and will be the next generation of leaders for our state. Next, get involved in your community's Yellow Ribbon community and assist in developing resources for military families to help ease their transition from warrior to citizen. Spend time with veterans who are living, and if you are a veteran, share your experiences. And last but not least, support Minnesota's Military Appreciation Fund in giving thanks to those veterans of the great state of Minnesota. These are just a few ways you can honor the sacrifice that service members have given so our freedoms stay intact.
Again, we'd like to thank you for allowing us to share our story and ask for your continued support of all Minnesota service members. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, there is no better example of a combination of patriotism and sacrifice than what we just heard from Jackie and Ron Stenger. Let's have one more round of applause for them. And for their daughters. And now, to introduce our next speaker, I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief, mainly because since he's a former CIA officer, I'm not sure exactly what I'm allowed to reveal. I probably know more than I should, and if I were to reveal those details, it's possible Mike Hurley might have to kill each and every one of you tonight before you finish dessert. So let me just leave it at this. I have known the Hurley family just about my entire life. In the 1970s and the 1960s, there were an incredible number of Hurleys and Hausers roaming the streets of Edina, just a couple miles from here. The Hauser family, there were 8 kids in our family, and we grew up about 2 miles from where I'm standing right now. The Hurley family, that direction, about 4 miles, and there were 10 of them. So you've got 10 members of this Irish Hurley family, roaming the streets of Edina, and I mean that quite literally. And then you had the Hausers, this German-Irish family, with a little bit of Hittite in there, just, again, we tried not to talk about that until tonight, but there was the one Hittite thing. And there was only 8 Hausers and there's 10 Hurleys, so you can imagine how busy we were because we spent much of our free time keeping the Hurleys out of trouble. So, and I'm happy to report now that Mike Hurley has been busy and spending much of his career trying to keep the United States out of trouble, or rushing to harm's way to make the United States and the world a safer place. Many of you know that he was very involved in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Several tours of duty for him as a member of the CIA in Afghanistan. And he is going to share some thoughts on that and other stories. And I hope that you are as anxious and excited to hear this presentation as I am. So please join me in welcoming Mike Hurley to the stage.
Thank you so much, Roger, Skip, board members, your families, the Minnesotans Military Appreciation Fund team, distinguished guests, most especially Minnesota military veterans and active duty service members. I'm deeply humbled and honored to be here tonight. Thank you for your generosity and gracious welcome. Tom, thank you for your kind words, and to the Hausers for protecting the Hurleys all these years. I must say I'm a little overcome by emotion listening to these very touching stories we've heard tonight. What you're doing here tonight and over the last 10 years is, in a word, extraordinary. It's one of the deepest honors of my life to be here with you and to talk with you. As I always do, I'm here representing the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Governor Tom Kean and Congressman Lee Hamilton. I told them that I would be meeting with you all, and they asked me to pass on their regards and their gratitude for what you're doing here. More about them just a little bit later. People sometimes ask me how I wound up in counterterrorism. Well, it started at an early age. You try growing up in Minnesota in a family with 7 brothers and 2 clever and scheming sisters. Surprise attacks were common. You get good in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and you develop unequaled survival skills. I love being here. As I said, I grew up in Minnesota just a stone's throw away, just a bit south on Highway 100, hang a left, and go about 6 blocks west. Speaking of Minnesota, throughout my career in government, I constantly cross paths with talented people with Minnesota connections and backgrounds. This is pretty common because Minnesotans are all over the place in the world. Some of you may know the dean of the U's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, Eric Schwartz, and the dean of the university's law school, David Whitman. I worked with both of them at the White House on the National Security Council staff. David was in my high school class at Edina. I played Little League football with him. The league named the teams after Big Ten mascots. Our team was the Gophers, the closest either David or I ever came to wearing Gopher gold. I remember when Eric was selected for the dean's job at the Humphrey School. He's from the East Coast, a Princeton guy. A couple of months into his tenure, I called him. "Hey, Eric, how's it going?" "Splendid," Mikey answered. Folks from Princeton like to use words like splendid. He said, "The people I work with are amazing. They're dedicated, they're energetic, they're imaginative, they're devoted to this school. I couldn't be happier. Except," "Well, what is it, Eric?" I noticed this hesitancy. "What is it? Something you don't like about Minnesotans?" "It's only," he started to say, "do you realize, Mike, people here actually have breakfast meetings at 6 a.m.? Evidently, that shocked him. He sort of thought it was uncivilized. No self-respecting Easterner would schedule a breakfast meeting before 9 a.m. "Sure, Eric, we have to get up early to milk the cows. That's what all Easterners think." He laughed. I can report that he's now often seen breakfasting at 5:30 a.m., so he's adapted. In 1990, I was nearing the end of my time at U.S. Embassy Paris. General Colin Powell was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a successor to General Vessey. The Iron Curtain had shredded. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria were all becoming democracies. The Soviet Union was disintegrating. General Powell was on his way back to Washington, having visited his counterparts in some of these countries. This was historic. He stopped in Paris to brief U.S. Embassy officials on what he had learned. U.S. Embassy Paris had played a key role in the Cold War. Many examples of the work that was done there. The briefing he wanted to give to diplomats there was to take place in the embassy's bubble. That's a secure room that the French or anyone else who might try to listen in on what was said couldn't penetrate with audio devices or bugs. Well, I was not going to miss this meeting, so I got into the bubble early, took my place. Shortly after that, 3 others joined. A woman and 2 men came in. They were not posted at the embassy, and I didn't know them. Different ages. They were U.S. government officials working for different agencies on business in Paris. They didn't know each other. This was a random meeting. As we waited, we introduced ourselves. I asked the woman closest to me where she was from. She answered, Minnesota. Said she was a grad of the U. Immediately, the 2 men chimed in and said they were from Minnesota and also graduated from the U. That made 4 of us, all at the meeting early. I wondered what that said about we Minnesotans. Well, I can tell you that many people around the world know about Minnesota, even in the remote mountains of Afghanistan, about 9,500 miles from here, or as I call it, a galaxy far, far away. I frequently met with warlords who headed powerful tribes. It could be very surprising what they knew about our country. Their knowledge base, though, could be a little comical, often quirky. Sometimes they didn't get things exactly right. Early in my deployment, my first deployment, as commander of a forward fire base, I had to meet with one of the most notorious of these strongmen. He was Pashtun, and he was chief of a large tribe and had a personal standing army of 5,000 men. He wasn't Taliban, and in theory was not our enemy, but he was a big problem. His force was ill-disciplined, financed by shaking down commercial truck drivers passing through areas he controlled, demanding payments, bribes, taxes. They constantly threatened Kabul central government officials. But worst, his men had the bad habit of firing their assault rifles into the air every time they heard a helicopter flying overhead. Often these were my helicopters, that is, my agencies, delivering weapons, ammunition, and cash. If the random fire kept up, someone was going to be killed, and then there would be all hell to pay. This guy was a thug, but I had to meet with him much to my distaste. He had to know there was a new sheriff in town, AKA me. My job was to get him to move his ragtag but dangerous militia out of the area as our forces built up, and to do it without bloodshed, if possible. I was going to do something special just to get his attention. He had to know that if he got out of line, I'd deliver a thunder punch he wouldn't soon forget. I cooked up a little plan, made a few calls on the radio, apprising the appropriate people of the time and place of the meeting. I arranged the meeting in a tent on our compound, Afghan carpets strewn everywhere on the floor. Picture the location, camels and horses milling around. It was like something out of the Old Testament. He arrived with a personal posse of bandolero-wearing, scimitar-wielding henchmen and bodyguards. Most of them seemed to me to be high on something. As the meeting began, he dismissed the interpreter, saying in good English he wasn't needed. Surprise number one, he spoke English. I wanted to get down to business, but he said, "I know a lot about your country. Would you like me to recite the names of all your presidents in the order in which they served?" Not really. Before I could say no, though, he was off to the races. He went through all the presidents. I think he got it right, though I'm not sure. I couldn't really verify it because my own knowledge was sketchy. I'm never quite sure about that succession of beards before Lincoln and after Lincoln. Then he listed them in reverse order. God, who can do that? Then, as I frantically tried to stop him, he started in on the vice presidents. This was supernatural. Nobody knows who they are. But he did, and I got the full brunt of it. After that parlor trick, he tired of his walk down American presidential history lane. And this is how the conversation developed. "Warlord, where are you from?" "Me. Minnesota, a state in the north." "Warlord, L'Étoile du Nord, the North Star," saying the state motto with a passable French accent. "Warlord, the land of 1 million streams, no?" "Me. Actually, no. It's 10,000 lakes." "Warlord, Warlord, and this is where the lumber tycoon, Mr. Paul Bunyan, and his baby with the blue box live, yes?" "Me. I think you mean Babe the Blue Ox. Anyway, they're dead." "Warlord, I'm sorry to hear that. May they rest in peace." "Amen, brother." Then he asked, "Is Minnesota where the people with heads of cheese live?" "Me. No, that's Wisconsin. They attend games between the Vikings and the Packers." "Warlord, well, who are the Vikings and Packers?" "Me. They are two of our most important tribes." The warlord suddenly getting very serious. "Do you know Sid Hartman?" "Me. Well, I know who he is." Now I'm really puzzled. How the heck does he know who Sid is? Seriously. "Warlord, does Sid work with the president?" "Me. I think he's one of the president's most important advisors. He's very influential, and Sid knows and is always writing about how he knows Bobby Knight. And I don't think even the president knows him." "Warlord, Badger Bobby Knight." "Me. Well, that would be Hauser Bobby Knight." "Warlord, I thought Gene Hackman was a Hauser." "Me. He's an actor. He just played a Hauser." Warlord scratches his chin, lost in thought about the Hackman Hauser lore. We then got down to business. I told him that he had to move his forces about 200 kilometers away pronto. He said he wasn't moving them an inch. He said that with a payment to him of $5 million in cash, it might be possible for him to impose a little discipline on his troops. I wasn't going to give this President lineage quoting shakedown artist a plugged Lincoln penny. I checked my watch. It was 1 minute before 6 p.m. I looked out the flap of the tent and I began moving out of the tent myself. I scanned the horizon and saw what I knew would be there. 2 F-14 Tomcats streaking in from the west, fully loaded, missiles bristling. The warlords saw them too. I braced myself for what I knew was about to happen. The fast-moving jets, blasting in about 500 feet off the deck, flashed over our location. I had given the United States Air Force the GPS coordinates of the tent, and they knew the time we would be in it. The pilots pulled up, put the pedal to the metal, so to speak, and these stunning aircraft flew as if shot out of a cannon, rocketing skyward. They kicked in the afterburners, and going hypersonic punched through the sound barrier. Boom! The shockwave mashed the tent, collapsing it. The warlord got knocked down from his chair. His turban was blown off his head. He nearly coughed up his choppers. His fierce men had all dived for cover. The warlord picks himself up and in a frightened voice says, "Who was that?" "Me, courtesy of the United States Air Force. They're close personal friends of Sid Hartman's." And, it must be said, Sid has more friends where they came from. And I have a direct line to Sid. Do you get the message? If you don't pull your troops out of this region by high noon tomorrow, Sid's pals are going to rain holy hell down on you. Do you get the message? Comprende? Warlord was still shaking as he beat a hasty retreat. By noon, there was not a man in his militia to be found in the area. No blood was shed. Mission accomplished. I've always called it the miracle of Sid. We all remember where we were on 9/11. I was at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. I was working in the basement of the building, managing an office of about 250 people. After the attacks on the towers in New York City and on the Pentagon, CIA highest management decided to evacuate our building because they believed it might be the next target that morning. Some people stayed on. Every person working in the counter-terrorist center, they were frantically trying to discover who had been on the airplanes, who had hijacked them, and working every angle they had just to learn what had happened. And they kept also certain core staff on, people that were regarded as essential to running the agency. And I was asked to stay on that morning and stay in the building because I had to be in contact with a number of our undercover people overseas during all this chaos. I walked later that morning down to the counter-terrorist center at CIA, and that is the office that had been tracking bin Laden and frankly trying to kill him for the 5 years or so before the 9/11 attacks. I volunteered to go to Afghanistan that day. It took 2.5 months, but then I was on my way. The first person to hit the ground in Afghanistan for the United States government following the attacks was a CIA veteran officer, and this occurred 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks. His name is Gary Schroen. Gary was 61 years old at the time. A 61-year-old CIA man led the first team in. Gary had turned in his retirement papers to CIA about 1 week before the 9/11 attacks. He showed up at the office that morning, the counter-terrorist center, and they told him, "You know those retirement papers? They're in the garbage. You're going out there." He was essential to the effort because Gary Schroen had served in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He had years in South Asia. He spoke fluent Farsi, Dari, and Pashto, the languages of that region. And this was of someone of inestimable value to the United States. And he was the first one to hit the ground. So you might be interested in how we got our people out to Afghanistan. Basically, you flew commercial from Washington to Frankfurt. You get on Uzbek Air to fly from Frankfurt to Tashkent, Uzbekistan. The U.S. government had worked an arrangement with the government of Uzbekistan. $50 million were involved to give us a military base there. and give us free ability to move in supplies and everything that we needed. From there, you would fly into Kabul once we got control of that, and from there we would be deployed to other parts of Afghanistan via helicopter. That's an interesting story because we weren't using US helicopters. We were using Russian, rather leftover Soviet helicopters, Mi-17s that CIA had bought from Russia. These were not, in 2001, state-of-the-art, but they'd been rebuilt, and the reason we wanted them, we did not want to fly in US identifiable aircraft. That was one reason. The other reason, they were actually pretty good at high altitude when the blades have to chew through thin air. But they were pretty rickety. And just getting out to the forward deployed areas was highly dangerous. We only flew at night. Our pilots flew using infrared vision devices. We flew at night so we couldn't be seen from the ground by the enemy. And sometimes as you were sitting in these helicopters at night, flying through high altitude passes in the mountains, it looked like the rotors were just mere inches from the solid granite mountains. On my first tour out there, I was sent to an area called Gardez in southeastern Afghanistan. This was a few months after 9/11. It was a forward fire base near the Pakistani border. It was at that time one of the most dangerous places in the world, so far out on the pointed edge of the spear, as far out as you could go. I commanded the forward fire base there, comprising CIA officers, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, British Special Air Services, British Special Boat Service units, and Australian Special Air Service, as well as U.S. Army Special Forces Green Berets and a 1,500-man friendly Afghan militia. Later on, I commanded a forward fire base a bit removed from there that was called Chapman Base. That was named after Neil Chapman, who was the first U.S. soldier to be killed in Afghanistan in 2002. We'll talk about that in a minute. Our forward fire base centered on a traditional mud-walled large Afghan compound. That's where we lived. It was far from any housing most Americans would ever consider living in. Very difficult living circumstances. This base was located at 9,500 feet altitude, ringed by higher mountains. I slept on the floor for months. Nights in the winter were extremely cold there, often below zero, and we had no central heat, obviously, just fires to keep us warm. It was also a desert. In the summer, the conditions were terrible, highly arid. Disease was a problem, especially from foodborne bacteria. You really couldn't eat the local food and certainly couldn't drink the local water. We had bottled water flown in. On an occasion, we would put iodine tablets in the water if we had to drink it. Even strong, young U.S. military personnel would get very sick if they ate the wrong thing. In Afghanistan, you see, the bacteria have bacteria. And it's different from anything we're used to. The instant your stomach started rumbling, erupting like the Krakatoa volcano, you grabbed ciprofloxacin. Our Navy SEAL medics had Pelican cases filled with this stuff. I'd pop them in my mouth like Pez candy from a Pez candy dispenser. It was a miracle drug. Spring brought infestations of flies and mosquitoes, making life miserable. When you typed on a laptop, you would have dozens of flies landing on your fingers. This was a malarial area. Methylquinine hydrochloride was the malaria prophylaxis that we used. You would take one per week. It was strong stuff, but it gave you vivid dreams. The warning said they were more like LSD hallucinations. I didn't know because I'd never tried that stuff. But you take this stuff, really, and you would have these vivid dreams. And the guy from the movies wearing the hockey goalie mask, carrying the chainsaw, would be chasing you all over the place. Don't take this medication, by the way, if you're psychotic. It will make your psychosis worse. There were a lot of dangers there. Snakes. I don't know about you, but I don't care that much for snakes. And they had snakes there. the most poisonous in the world, pit vipers, saw-scaled vipers, hooded and king cobras, and maybe the worst, a snake called a crate. One bite from a crate, and it's lights out. Good night, Irene. Goodbye, cruel world. In about 30 seconds, you're licking the inside of a pine box. Military headquarters kept telling us that they had insufficient anti-venom medication. Thanks. Please try to get some here fast. One morning I woke up and saw a Navy SEAL a few cots down from me shaking his boot. A crate fell out. Well, that's a fine how do you do in the morning. The SEAL was pretty nonchalant about it. He quickly dispatched the crate to Viper Heaven with his machete. And he asked, "Do you want to cook this up in our omelet this morning?" I think I'll pass, I'm good. Ever since then, each morning, before I put my moccasins on, I first pick them up by the toe and give them a little shake. Call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. When I stay at a brother's home here in Minnesota, I always ask a niece or nephew to do it, figuring their reflexes are quicker than mine. Just kidding. So who was with me? We talked a little bit about that. CIA personnel. The Special Forces and Special Operations Forces. Delta Force is really an amazing force, and so is SEAL Team 6. These Delta guys are so tough, they shave with blowtorches. We've all seen pretty strong people doing one-arm push-ups. They can do one-arm pull-ups, lots of them. When they hold their M4s and M16s, they kind of look like toothpicks against their forearms. And these are the guys, you know, that we send in for the most dangerous assignments, the one that kick in doors, try to rescue hostages, the most difficult operations, and you've seen them in Zero Dark 30 depicted. They're holding their weapons, they've got their lights on their helmets, searching through darkened buildings, turning a corner, pop, 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 taking out the enemy. These guys are really cool, and they made you feel less afraid when you were with them. So we had them. What was my task? My task was to develop intelligence on the location of the enemy, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. By spring 2002, we had cleared out most of them from Afghanistan, but we were trying to find their last redoubt. We found that in mountains just 15 kilometers away from our compound, in an area called the Shikote Valley. And for 2 months, my team and I participated in planning for what became known as Operation Anaconda, which would eventually be the biggest military operation in the Afghanistan campaign. And to do that, we tried to develop local sources. You didn't have time to do what you normally do to get to know someone who might be an agent and determine whether they were trustworthy or not. There was no time for this. You basically just had to kind of go with your gut feeling. You'd have to try to verify the information that they gave you. They give you information because you gave them money. You can't always rely on that. Big United States military and the command were really reluctant to make decisions, as they justifiably should have done, based on that kind of intelligence. But it was difficult to get confirmation of the location of the enemy from overhead systems like satellites because the cloud cover was so heavy and the conditions were so bad. What we really needed was U.S. eyes on target to confirm where the bad guys were. And that's where SEAL Team 6 came in, Marine Force Recon that was with us, and Army Rangers, because they went up into the mountains weeks before the offensive began in their winter whites, you know, the white camouflage, burrowed themselves in the snow with their high-powered scopes just to watch and get number counts and develop as much intelligence as possible on the location of the enemy. And they came back with it, and they sent that up the chain of command. And that convinced our military and our policymakers in Washington that, yes, there was a substantial force there and that we could go ahead with this operation. So that was the beginning of Operation Anaconda. And it kicked off on March 2nd, 2002. And it was rather an extraordinary day because that morning, I had breakfast very early in the morning, 1:30, 2 o'clock a.m., with our Special Forces guys. Now, they were there, and their job was to train and equip our friendly Afghan militia that we were deploying on this operation. And so I had breakfast with them. And I've gotten to know one of them, Sergeant Stanley Harriman. And the trucks rolled out that morning at about 3 o'clock in the morning, bright stars, and they headed for this valley. The timing was set for the bombing to begin. The bombing began, but even before that, within 2 hours of leaving our base, Stanley Harriman, a father of two, was killed by friendly fire. His truck got separated from the convoy, and our pilots mistakenly thought it was enemy vehicle. That happens in war, and it's very unfortunate. And we all lost a good friend and a very brave man. And you will remember this. The world's attention was focused on this part of the world, this very, very remote part of the world, for 2 weeks because of the bombing that took place there. But into the beginning of the second day, a helicopter carrying Navy SEALs and other Special Operations Forces personnel was reconnoitering a high peak in the area. Taliban enemy soldiers fired an RPG at the helicopter. The damaged helicopter tilted, and SEAL Petty Officer First Class Neil Roberts fell out the rear ramp about 10 feet to the ground. The helicopter was in bad shape, and it crash-landed some distance away from there. They didn't know whether their comrade was dead or alive, quite frankly. They just knew he was absent. So that began some real well-organized but very quick operations to get in there and find him. If he was dead, bring his body back. If he was alive, to save him. So the SEALs sent in another helicopter. And the SEALs hit the ground. They found their friend's body, but then they were ambushed. And suddenly, in one short, brief battle, the United States had lost 7 Navy SEALs. This was the biggest loss of life of its kind since Black Hawk Down in Mogadishu years earlier. The dead and the wounded were ferried back to our compound, and that was a very chaotic morning trying to take care of them. Ever since then, that battle has been called the Battle of Roberts Ridge, after Neil Roberts. And I should add that that battle took place at the highest altitude that U.S. forces have ever engaged in our history. It was an extraordinary thing. Now, you run into this in government. I'm then back later that day at our compound, dealing with evacuating these brave soldiers that are wounded and taking care of the dead and doing all those things. You can imagine how difficult it was and just what the scenery was. Well, I got this cable from headquarters that came in with the highest, what they call precedence on it. Cables come in, messages come in. If they're routine, you can kind of ignore them. If they bear a heading flash on it, you better not ignore it because they want an answer right away. But it was kind of stupid because somebody back in Washington thought that this tragedy was the result of an intelligence failure. Well, unfortunately, you lose brave people in wartime. And they asked me to stop everything I was doing to write an explanation of what intelligence we had. And I sent a short message back to headquarters, which was then communicated it to the Secretary of Defense. And it basically said, "I'll get to this later, Hurley out." Later on that day, when I had time, it was late at night, I sent another reply back. I didn't write any text to it. I just listed 40 references. Each reference was a reference to a report that we'd put out over the preceding 3 or 4 weeks, detailing, and a lot of this had been obtained by the soldiers, but by my men as well, detailing the strength of the enemy, where they were located, the weapons they had, and that they would fight. And that was the last we heard about an intelligence failure. I should tell you that I had the opportunity to work with some extraordinary people. The military was really impressive. My own people were very, very impressive. There was one young man I want to tell you about who came while I was at Gardez, and his name was Helga Bose. Helga was a first-generation American. His parents were German, but he had been born in the United States. Helga, in German, is also a boy's name. He had an E, not an A, after the G. And Helge was an extraordinary young man because he'd only been in the agency for about 2 years at the time of the 9/11 attacks. He had been a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and he was a Harvard Law School graduate. And as you can imagine, he was working for a blue-chip law firm. But you recall that we had 2 embassies attacked in East Africa by al-Qaeda in August 1998, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And those attacks killed 212 people, I think. 12 of those 212 were Americans. 200 were Africans. 1,000 Africans were wounded, 5,000 Africans were wounded, 1,000 were blinded in those attacks. And Helge was at home, a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and he decided, I want to get involved in this. I can't sit on the sidelines. So he applied to CIA. They're always happy to get people with minimal qualifications, like a Harvard Law School degree. So he came into the agency. Now, he's then later deployed, after his training, to Gardez, and he comes in there. Now, these soldiers, as I said that we were with, and sailors, were tough as nails. And they could kind of chew up and spit out Harvard Law School grads. But this guy was pretty special. He won their respect immediately. He went on patrols with them. I mean, they admired the intelligence of the reports that he sent in. He had a way with the Afghan soldiers we had to deal with, settling their disputes, ensuring they were taken care of. Really, really good at getting intelligence from the local people. Just an extraordinary guy. I'll come back to that. After Operation Anaconda, I came back to the States for a little bit of R&R, and I was back here in Edina with my family, meeting with my brothers, and spent some time here. And then I redeployed to Afghanistan in fall of 2002. In late November 2002, I was woken up late at night. A message had come in because my family had contacted CIA headquarters to inform me that our father had died here in Minneapolis. It was sad, but it was not unexpected because he'd been under 24-hour care due to an accident, a fall that he had for the preceding year and a half. So I made my way back from Afghanistan to Minneapolis, and that took about 3 or 4 days, as I recall. And with my family, we mourned just up the street my father's death. I gave the eulogy at his funeral. He was a Navy veteran. He had served in World War II. He didn't see action because he was still in training in late 1944, so he never got overseas, but he was a sailor, and he always took great pride in that, in serving the government. So he was buried at Memorial Cemetery, and they had a 21-gun salute, and it was really, really nice send-off for him. So I spent another week here, or so, helping my family deal with this, and then I went back to Washington, and this was just a little bit before Christmas, 2002. And I was scheduled to go back, to get on the plane to go back to Afghanistan on Christmas Day. But 3 or 4 days before that, I got, I think, the saddest call that I've ever had in my life when a brother called to inform me that our older brother had passed away suddenly. I came back here. We were all deeply saddened. This was such a huge shock. And I came back here, same church, Our Lady of Grace, just up the street here, and gave the eulogy for my brother. And then I stayed for another week or so, and I went back to Washington, once again preparing to go back to Afghanistan, and that took longer this time. But by early February, I was about a week to 10 days away from returning. And I was at headquarters, and I was very happy to see walking in the hallway Helge Bose, my friend and the young officer that I thought so highly of. And I asked him, hey, what's up? He said, I'm going back to Afghanistan. Well, when do you leave? In 2 days. I said, I'll be out there in about 10 days. I hope our paths cross. He said, do you have time for a drink tonight? I said, sure. I got together with him. We talked about some of the things we had talked about in Afghanistan. And he talked about his wife. He talked about his plans to have a family. He talked about something he was interested in my background. I'd served on the National Security Council staff. And he said that's something that he wanted to do. I said, it won't do your career any good. He said, I don't care. He said, I don't care. I want to do it. I said, that's great. We parted company, and I said to him what we tend to say to each other in our business. Maybe you say it in the military, I don't know, but when someone's going to a dangerous area, the goodbye is, keep your head down. Keep your head down. He said the same to me. I said, I'll see you in a week or so. He leaves for Afghanistan a day later. 2 days after that, word came that he had been killed less than 24 hours after arriving in Afghanistan. A couple days later, and it's important to know, his parents were German. They knew he was in the US government, but they didn't know he worked for CIA. They thought he worked for the State Department. And suddenly they're told that their son is dead. And they were flown to the States. Helga's body was taken back on an aircraft that arrived at Andrews Air Force Base. And a good portion of the counterterrorist center of CIA was on hand to be there. And I was there. A day or two later, there was a memorial service for him at CIA headquarters. And the director of CIA then was George Tenet, my boss. And George Tenet asked me to deliver a eulogy for Helga Bose, whose family was now coming to our headquarters, and the entire workforce was gathered there for this memorial service. And this was my third eulogy in, I think, 80 days. And I want to tell you what I said about Helga Bose at that ceremony. I said, when I think of Helga, I think of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Like JFK, Helga was intelligent, attractive, and charismatic. In Profiles in Courage, Kennedy defined courage as grace under pressure and wrote, a man does what he must. A man does what he must in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures. A providential characteristic of our country is that in times of peril, it produces leaders of admirability and courage. Sometimes, like Ulysses S. Grant, who at the start of the Civil War was selling saddles in Galena, Illinois, a failed Army captain, but 4 years later, commander of Union forces. Well, sometimes they come from Galena, Illinois, but sometimes they come from Harvard Law School. Although junior in tenure, Helga Bose had the makings of a leader, and based on snippets from many conversations, it became clear he believed that to assert a moral claim to leadership, he had to risk it all. I always had the sense that Helga volunteered to lead the fight against terrorism because he was the best, and that therefore it was his duty. True heroism, I think, may be broader than specific acts of bravery. It's best exhibited in military virtues of self-sacrifice, doing hard things in hard places, sustained effort to achieve a worthy goal. Helga, who could have had a sedate and monetarily enriching life as a high-powered lawyer, chose to put himself in harm's way to protect his country. He was an extraordinary individual. Another major sacrifice that you all know about involved the hunt for bin Laden, actually the hunt for bin Laden's deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri. I'm just going to say a couple quick things about this. You can read about this if you're interested. The best story is in a book called Triple Agent by Joby Warwick of the Washington Post. And he begins that book saying, inside the headquarters of the secretive National Security Agency in suburban Washington is a computer search engine unlike any other in the world. Its code name is Turbulence. It is a $500 million computer. And this can crawl up computers and monitors anywhere in the world and pluck out who's using them and what they're saying. Now, this isn't classified information anymore. It's in this book. But I guess I can't say this actually exists. All I'll say is that Joby Warwick is a damn good reporter. I would say using this machine or machines like this, the US government got onto a person in Jordan, in Amman, who had been posting things on one of these chat rooms, very radical stuff. He was a physician, this guy too, Humam al-Balawi. This information was shared with the Jordanians, and one night he got a knock on his door, and suddenly he's going in to have a nice talk with the local intelligence service. Well, they supposedly turned him, convinced him that what he was doing was wrong, but they saw some utility in this guy. Why? Well, he's a physician, and he's an Arab. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 behind bin Laden, was also a physician. The key was to find out where he was. So the Jordanians and my agency figured that this guy could be helpful. So they worked with him. They deployed him to Pakistan, where he supposedly penetrated a group of physicians and so on, and was sending information that he had information on the location of the notorious Ayman al-Zawahiri. As a consequence, in December 2009, al-Balawi was given a warm welcome at a secret CIA base in eastern Afghanistan. His American handlers believed him to be a secret agent working on their behalf to penetrate al-Qaeda and learn the whereabouts of the number 2. In fact, he was a triple agent working for al-Qaeda, and he used this special access to detonate a concealed bomb and kill 7 CIA officers and several of their associates. That was at the same base I told you about, the second one that I commanded in Coast, Chapman Field. Lots of sacrifices, CIA, the military. You know, the Greeks had an idea of what was a hero, and it's a little bit different of what we think about a hero. We think a hero is, and it's true, this is one form of a hero, someone who runs into a burning building to save a baby. That's an act of heroism. But to the Greeks, a hero was someone who went through an ordeal. And what I want to tell you is that every single one of the Minnesotans who have deployed to combat zones are literally heroes under that definition, because they're going through ordeals, and it doesn't matter what their job is. Some may be more inherently risky than others. You know, the other day I was in the gym using my iPod, and my iPod broke. Machines break. The machines that the military uses, the planes, the helicopters, even the trucks, they're complex systems, and they break. The point I want to make is, even if you're doing something routine, it can be quite deadly, potentially. Now, the beauty of the military is it makes highly, highly dangerous activities seem routine. Taking off from an aircraft carrier is a hard thing to do, and they're able to do it and make it seem simple because of constant training. So I firmly believe that everybody who answers the call and goes to these places is facing an ordeal, and I want to get to that a little bit more in just a second. But let me just show a few photos to give you an idea of some of the things I'm talking about. And I'm going to go through these quickly. Oops. That's a typical compound. It's very similar to the ones that we lived in. And I should say that it was kind of interesting, because we didn't just go in and take these compounds. You know, you don't want to antagonize the local population. So I would go in and find the patriarch of the compound and sit down with him, and he'd have his family gathered around, and I'd sort of say, look, we have a need for this compound. Could we get it from you? We'll return it in good order. Maybe not. And they'd sort of always say, well, my family has been here for 700 years, and this is impossible. It's absolutely impossible. I'd pull out a stack, say $10,000, and put it on the coffee table and not say anything. We can be out by 5 p.m. By 5 p.m., you'd see them heading off in a truck, and you'd have their place. That's kind of how that worked. Those are some special operations forces, probably Delta or Navy SEALs. You can see the high mountains in the background. They're getting ready to deploy. I think they're getting ready to go up and do some of this observing of the enemy. These are just some books, I think, that are of interest in terms of the 9/11 story. That is our compound. And that flat area is really a plateau, and that flat area is 9,500 feet, and those mountains go up much higher behind us. And the problem for us was that the enemy would go into those mountains at night and put indirect fire, mortar fire down in on us. And we'd have our spotters, and you could push them away pretty quickly, but there's always the chance that one of them might come crashing into our compound. Now, this is interesting. On the right is the Shikote Valley where Operation Anaconda took place. Remember, I told you it was the highest altitude the U.S. military has ever fought at. On the left are caves that we had to clear looking for the enemy. Now, maybe you can see right in the middle, there's a figure, and that's a Navy SEAL. I'm the one taking the picture. Now, when you went into one of these caves, like the absolutely worst heart-stopping sound that you could possibly hear was a noise like this. Hiss. And you'd shine your flashlights against the wall, and you'd see maybe 6 or 7 king cobras or hooded cobras kind of stretched out to full vertical height. That's why I call this photo, and I'm taking the picture, you first. Here we're gathered in the interior of the compound. Those are Special Operations Forces planning Operation Anaconda. That place grew from maybe 100 personnel to probably 300 personnel. It became basically a virtual small city. We had a flash flood that knocked down our wall, and that was dangerous, both because of indirect fire potentially, but also because the enemy could then see inside the compound. So we put up HESCO barriers. You can see we built blast berms in front of the compound. I basically took over the road and a mile away on either end put roadblocks up and soldiers so no vehicles could come down, but we were afraid if a truck rammed through that somehow and got through, you wanted a blast berm in case a bomb went off to deflect the blast over the compound. That's an old Soviet tank. Lots of these are left over from the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. It didn't work, by the way, but at night we towed it in to our compound and sort of set it up so it looked kind of forbidding because the enemy didn't know whether it worked or not. Oh, this is interesting. That's a Green Beret. There's a famous picture at the same site. I say it's famous because what happened was our entire team, including Green Berets, Special Operations Forces as well, and my CIA guys, had a photo taken in front of there. I can't show it because it would show their identities and someone would get mad. This guy has his head down. What happened was the Pentagon sent out to every team, every CIA team operating in Afghanistan with military support, a little piece taken from the World Trade Center. And we symbolically buried the piece near our compound, as the other teams did as well, to show the historic connection now between what had happened in Afghanistan and what had happened in New York City. So we've just there buried that piece of the Pentagon. And a photo was taken that had the GPS coordinates, and that photo was then sent via email to our headquarters. And the head of our counterterrorist center took it to the director of CIA, who took it to the White House and presented it to George Bush. This was in 2002. And George Bush kept that photo on his desk, not in the Oval Office, but in the little office off the Oval Office for the rest of his time in office. There's me meeting. That's not the warlord I was describing. This is actually a good guy, kind of local leaders. One of the things that happens in these situations is you almost become a new proconsul. Anybody remember Kipling's novella, The Man Who Would Be King? The movie with Sean Connery? two British adventurers who basically get declared king in that part of the country. Well, these people started coming to us and asking us where they should put their roads and their highways, or where they should build their hospitals, where they should build their schools. And you really literally play this role, and that's what's going on there. I'm meeting with the governor of the province. The guy on the right is an interpreter. I'm sitting in the middle there in the upper left. They started a girls' university, a women's university. Women were not allowed to be educated in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule, so this was really a nice thing. And they had children singing at that ceremony. Singing was not allowed in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. Now it was. That's a doctor I'm with, and that's a hospital, believe it or not, behind us. We supplied medical supplies to them and gave them equipment, all to kind of buy hearts and minds. You needed their help. You needed them telling us where the enemy was. This is all part of force protection. More meetings like that. Our 1,500-person Afghan friendly militia that we deployed in Operation Anaconda, white phosphorus going off near our fort. These are just some quick shots of Chapman Base. This is the base that was blown up in 2009 by the triple agent. Kind of a typical place where folks would sleep. I should say in the winter it was so cold that I never took my clothes off. I slept in a stocking cap with my boots on, in a sleeping bag, inside another sleeping bag. More shots like that. This is all coast. You just get a look at the terrain. Very quickly. Beautiful children in Afghanistan, more of them. Look at the faces. We always loved to see the helicopters coming in. It meant someone was going home. This is inside our compound. The team I headed was initially, usually teams were given the same name they used on the radio as their call sign, and we were first called Team Romeo, which I kind of liked. Later we were called Team India. Those camels, they're baby camels, young camels, were given to me by a local warlord who was kind of grateful for the protection we gave him, and that's sort of a prized possession there. So I then changed the name of our compound to Camelot. You know, there's a quote that's, I think, mistakenly attributed to Winston Churchill. Sometimes it's attributed to George Orwell. It's unclear who actually said it, but the quote is, "We sleep soundly in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who would do us harm." I'm not sure I like that quote that much. I think it's very intelligent men and women stand ready to do what is appropriate to protect us now. You all remember as school kids, we had to memorize Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Everybody gets that wrong, the last sort of stanza of that. And we always say, "There's not to reason why, there's but to do or die." It's actually, there's but to do and die. But I think for us, for our military, for the people we have deployed in these areas, it's there's but to do and to do more and to do more and to do more. Now, you don't usually associate imagination with big bureaucracies. But I can tell you that the capabilities of the people I deployed with and who were out there protecting us was just really, really impressive. If vehicles broke down, they fixed them. If a radio broke, they got communications up. If someone was hurt, they had the medical skills to deal with it. And of course, they had their fighting skills as well. These are all-around people. And my impression, and I worked with high-level commanders in the field and in Washington. And it's always seemed to me that if you reach the rank of general officer, General Vessey, you have the equivalent of about 5 PhDs or more, given the breadth of the problems that you have to deal with as a commander. I think it's true of our ambassadors as well to different countries. I think our force, it's sort of a cliche. You hear this all the time. This is the best force in our history and all of that. Well, I think it's really true. And the reason I think it's true is because the training has gotten better, but to me, our military is a living thing. It's a living organism, and it learns. And the military is really very good. It makes mistakes, but it's good at learning from its mistakes. And I always kind of think of that. What we have are people that figure things out. They discern what needs to be done. You know, I know you had here a few years ago Tom Friedman, the great columnist and fellow Minnesotan. I don't know if he said this the night he was here or not, but it's something that he's written that's always impressed me. And he's argued that the next Nobel Prize should go to the United States military. It's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because Nobel Peace Prize going to an institution that is designed to make war and to win war and to wage war. But when you stop and think about it, our military has kept the peace. You know, not long ago, well, actually it was pretty long ago, I went on to Ramstein Air Force Base it was very long ago, in what was then West Germany. And I was on this operation. I was working with the British government very closely. And it was actually pretty cool because it's the only time in my career I was working with them so closely that I was actually given a card that I was to use with the British if I got in trouble anyplace that said, "On Her Majesty's Secret Service," and my name. So it's pretty nice. And it ended up at Ramstein Air Force Base. We were getting debriefed there. I've always gotten up early in my life. And I walked out on one of the airstrips, landing strips at that base, early one morning about 5:30. And the commander of the base, who I knew happened to be an early riser, and he was out for his morning jog, and he came by me. And he walked up to me and said, "Isn't it beautiful?" And I knew what he meant. Lined up along the sides of the strip, spaced out, were fighter after fighter after fighter, and they were catching the morning sun as it glinted off the blue-gray wings. And it wasn't a bellicose feeling I had. It was, these machines and these people that maintain this order are ready to go in defense of peace anywhere in the world. You can kind of get the same feeling if you've ever been on an aircraft carrier. And so I really believe that our military deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for what they've done. Now, I'm going to wrap up here, but there's a few things that I feel I must say. And one is that I just want to say a word or two about what it means when we say thanks. And I'll give a couple of personal stories on how powerful thanking somebody is. And this is because that's what we're here doing tonight. Some years ago, I was meeting a cooperative source, let's say, not an agent, in a foreign country. And I won't say the name of the country, but the Riviera's in it. And it has a big film festival every summer and very nice beaches. And by the way, I was pretty good throughout my career. Like, you often have to meet people discreetly, right? So you can't meet in the big cities where people are watching you, so you have to pick kind of places where, you can go. And I'd often be quite good in the winter months at picking Chamonix, Davos, Stade, San Moritz. And in the summer, well, the Riviera, I guess. So one night I'm meeting this guy who's a cooperative person with us, and very, very bright. Get to the end of our meal, breaking it up. I've gotten from him what I needed to get. He knew me as Charlie. He called me Charlie. And we're about to say goodbye. And he said, "Just a moment, Charlie." And he signals to the waiter. This is in spring. And he says, "Bring a bottle of the house's finest champagne." And he looks at me and says, "Don't worry, it's not going on your expense account. I'm covering this." Okay. Champagne comes, he uncorks it, pours a couple of glasses, raises his hand in toast, and he says, "Charlie, to the United States of America, some of us haven't forgotten." And it was June 6th, the anniversary of D-Day. And he was talking about Normandy. And if you've ever been there and seen the American cemeteries and the white crosses lined up, it was, for me, a very powerful and poignant thank you, and it was highly meaningful. Another time, I'm at U.S. Embassy Paris. This is summer 1989. It's a significant year because it's the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. Everybody's celebrating in France. The government has arranged a whole series of high-level visits. They've also scheduled the Group of 8 meeting, the meeting of the 8 most wealthiest countries. And President George H.W. Bush was president then, and he was leading a big entourage over, and world leaders from all over the place to come and help the French celebrate this really significant date. And I'll never forget, I didn't know President Bush. I'd never met him. I was a junior diplomat at the embassy. And supporting a presidential visit is, really hard work. And it's just, so many things can go wrong, security problems, whatever it is. So he actually was there for a long time, 4 or 5 days, a long time for a president to be out of the States. And at the end of this, everything has gone well, and he and Barbara Bush are in the embassy, and he's with the U.S. ambassador, a friend of his, and the ambassador's wife, and they'd stayed and been the guests at the ambassador's residence, which was an old Rothschild palace that the Rothschild family had given the United States government in gratitude for our role in the Second World War liberating France. So President Bush came and stood before all the people that worked so hard, and he thanked us. A very amiable man. He thanked us. There were about 40 of us there or so. And I felt that, and it was heartfelt, but that's not the reason I'm telling you this story. The reason I'm telling you this story is what happened next. So he said, I'd like to take some questions. Ask me anything. And a friend standing next to me, the first question he sort of said, Mr. President, you've been here quite a while. You must be going straight back to Washington, right? And the president said, no, I'm going to make a sort of short stop. Oh, really? Well, everybody figured presidents always go to the important allies, the Brits, the Italians, the Germans. So he's going to go to, then it would have been Bonn, to Rome, to London. And he said, no, we're going to the Netherlands. So my friend sort of said, well, that's very interesting. Not really the most important country as far as the U.S. is concerned, Mr. President. The president said, well, you're right in a way. He said, but I read a book last year in 1988. It was a book called The First Salute by Barbara Tuchman, the historian. And she told this story. I recommend the book, by the way. She told this story that the Dutch were actually the first country to salute the American flag after we declared independence. Morocco was the first country to establish diplomatic relations. Most people think that that first salute was really the most symbolic. And here President Bush said, so I'm going there because I also discovered that no American president had ever gone to Holland to thank the Dutch for that. So it's 200 years later. He said, I'm in the neighborhood. I'm going to stop by to say thank you. And that's, I think, a very meaningful thank you. And I think the point that I want to make to you all tonight is that saying thank you is important, but you're doing a lot more than that here in Minnesota. Every time each of these 30,000 or more Minnesotans have deployed to a combat zone, there comes a moment, and you heard some of this a little bit earlier, there comes a moment when they have to say goodbye. They have to kiss a wife goodbye, a husband goodbye, say goodbye to their kids, their little kids maybe, their family. And they do that knowing they might not be coming back. I was single. My moment always came when I was turning the key in the lock on my little townhouse in Northern Virginia, wondering whether I'd see it again. But there comes a moment when that happens. Or whether, if they do come back, whether they'll be in the same condition they're in when they leave. And it's so important that you're recognizing that. Have you ever had the experience, I think we all have, when something happens in your life, and as you get older you realize your life can turn on a dime, literally. Well, in these hardship places, it can happen a lot more often than it happens here. But you had the experience where something sort of bad has happened to you, or maybe you're just feeling a little bad or down. And then you get a call from a friend, or a friend stops by. They don't even know what's going on with you, and how buoying that is, and how it boosts you and lifts you up. And the thing is, all these grants that you've made, you don't know, and this is a great thing, some of them may have happened at a time that have changed the recipient's life. They've just come at that exact moment when they needed to know that someone cared. And I think, look, we all pay our taxes, military gets its support, its equipment, all that kind of stuff. We cheerfully pay our taxes on April 15th, right? But when you give money and you support this organization, it's really far more than that, because what you're saying, I'm a member of the team too, and you buy into it. And a fundamental thing that I've realized in my life is that there's danger on the horizon. We're going to face danger in the future. And to be honest, it's never, ever, ever going to really get easier. It'll be different. The threats will be different, but we're not going to reach some utopian state where we have to stop worrying about defending ourselves and training the people that will defend us. We've gotten out of Iraq, we're drawing down in Afghanistan, but you see we're already still conducting air missions there. All these things are going on. If you're my age, 30, you remember when the Cold War ended, what was everybody looking forward to? The peace dividend. How's that working for you? I spent mine at Starbucks. No, this is ongoing. And I know those of you that have come here tonight, this costs a lot of money. But the more that you can give, and give till it hurts, the better. And the more in the future you can work your own personal networks, which are impressive, to get other people interested, the better. I find what you're doing hugely inspiring, because right now, as you all know, there are 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds out in some of the most godforsaken parts of the world, just kind of controlling their fears because they're trained, and they're protecting us from some very, very, very real dangers. Now, I said I wanted to get back to the 9/11 Commission briefly, and I'm closing out here. Because there's a lot to be cynical these days, especially in our politics, especially about Washington. Just a ton of things to be cynical. They're not getting things done. But what I saw from our leadership on the 9/11 Commission was really, truly impressive. I was present on the day when the 10 commissioners, 5 partisan Republicans and 5 partisan Democrats, voted on whether to publish the report as it stood that day. I was present in the room. And I felt like I was looking through the keyhole of history at another time, because that report was 527 pages long, with endnotes. And there had been fights all the way through it, these people fighting back and forth, but they finally reached agreement, and they raised their hands and said, aye, aye, aye. And it came out, and it had a real powerful effect. And I thought about our country when I served on that commission, and I sat across as a lead questioner of presidents of the United States, asking them to explain the decisions they had taken and not taken with respect to defending the country against the growing al-Qaeda threat in the months and years before 9/11. And only in this country can you do something like that. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for, and I'm inspired by our military, because they just go out and get the job done. And to end, last summer, I produced a report for the 10 9/11 commissioners, and I had a hand in writing that report. And this is how it ended. We ask much of those with the responsibility to protect us. Thousands of people whose names never appear in the headlines have risen to the occasion and kept the United States safe. Facing danger with courage, our military is doing hard things in hard places. For all of them, every day feels as urgent as the day after 9/11. Far too many have given their lives protecting their country and their fellow citizens. All of them have our profound admiration and gratitude. Thank you so much. Peace.
Mike, don't go away just yet. Roger, sit. Come on up to say a few words. Mike, please come back up on stage.
Mike, thank you very much for your service. Thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to come and speak to the MMAF organization. You had tremendous insight, tremendous experience, and just as a small token of our appreciation, I'd like to give you a Minnesotans Military Appreciation desk plaque for you to keep.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Mike Hurley. Now, our evening together is nearly done, but please join me in thanking all of our terrific speakers tonight. Their experiences and insights are invaluable, and I encourage everyone to share what you've heard here with friends and family. Again, round of applause for all of our speakers tonight. And very importantly, if you wish to support MMAF and make a donation tonight, there are envelopes on your table that can be dropped in the donation box outside of the ballroom as you exit tonight. And know this, every dollar raised tonight, every single dollar goes directly toward MMAF grants. Every dollar. And why is that possible? Well, Sid Investments has underwritten this entire event, and that ensures that every dollar raised here tonight, again, every dollar, I can't stress that enough, goes back to our military and their families. Also, Michael Hurley has waived his speaking fees for this evening's event. That is also worthy of more applause. I did insist on the $1.50 I usually get for engagements like this, so again, thank you all. By being here tonight, you have helped thank Minnesota troops to the tune of nearly $500,000. Again, that's tonight alone. Give yourselves a big round of applause. And finally, before we leave, I want to make you aware of an upcoming event taking place this fall. It is MMAF's Say Thanks Day Walk and Run event, which will take place this year on Saturday, September 12th. This year, we're bringing the Wall That Heals to this event. It's a half-scale replica of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. Please see the insert in your program for more about that event. And any of you who like to run, and I know who some of you are, this is a great event. I've done this before, and it really is a lot of fun, and another great fundraiser for MMAF and a way to say thanks. So, as we conclude, please welcome VocalEssence back to sing God Bless America and America the Beautiful. We do so appreciate their performing for us tonight. Now, if you would please stand as our honor guard, we'll also retire our flag after their performance. Ladies and gentlemen, they are VocalEssence. Outstanding. Thank you very much. That is our program for tonight. Everybody drive safely. And again, thank you all for being here, and we thank you for your generosity.